Welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. I'm Gerry Scott, founder of the Snowbirds US Day Tracker and the Canada Physical Presence Tracker app.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's Gerry Scott here from the Snowbirds US Snowbirds Expat Podcast. I have a returning guest today. His name is Oliver Branch, and he's in charge of immigration at Moody Law, but I call it Moody Tax, Moody Law.
Moody Private Client Law is us now, yeah.
We call it everything. So really what we want to cover today, and this has been, I just got this email the other day, Oliver, and it was just unbelievable, more about this 12-month rolling calendar schedule. And I'll tell you something, I read a lot, and I'm going back and forth, and I thought, boy, I could be an immigration lawyer, I could be a tax lawyer, I could be all the above.
Don't steal my job.
I'll tell you today, your job is not threatened. Today I'm very humbled because when you hear more and more cases of clients that are going through these negative experiences, it is tough. So I spent the last hour going through the internet, reading about as much about it as possible. I put together my homemade little spreadsheet, trying to figure out the rolling calendar. And I'll tell you, I'm thinking I'm wasting my time. I need to call up Oliver and just say, Oliver, please help us out here. So I've got some great questions for you today. And this podcast today could go on for about 24 hours. So I hope you got your sleep.
I have coffee. I'm good to go.
Okay. Well, for a guy who doesn't drink coffee, maybe we should be concerned about the host today, because if you see me nodding off, it's not because of lack of interest. It's because I am just into the 18th hour. I tend to kind of fall asleep. So here we are. Let's get going. And these questions are going to have long answers, I'm sure. And from this podcast, and you and I've talked about this before, I really believe we're going to have to put on a live webinar and get people to call in, because I'll tell you something. It is so confusing when we're talking about immigration and tax. And so here we are.
Sure.
The first question, and we're going to go really easy on you.
Okay.
Do Canadians require a visa to enter the U.S. as a visitor? If so, what type of visa?
So, great question. No, Canadians do not require a visa to enter the U.S. But you know what? A lot of times Canadians don't know that when they enter the U.S., they're still a B1 or a B2 visitor, right? So a lot of times with Canadians, I mean, look, we both are gray enough, not too gray enough to remember when it was just a smile and a wave and you just drove right on in and no one asked any questions, right? So times have changed a bit, but when you do enter, even though you don't have the visa, when you're at the border, that's called status that they give you, and it's B1 or B2. But luckily, Canadians, they don't have to go to the consulate first and get a visitor visa stamped in their passport and deal with all of that the way people from a lot of other countries do.
Okay, so like I say, the first few questions are really simple and easy, but as we get into this 12-month rolling calendar and I-94 and all this other stuff, it's going to be it'll be lengthy.
Yeah.
So what is the difference between a visitor visa, an ESTA, and status?
Right. Thanks for the easy questions at the beginning. I appreciate that. That was a little bit. Okay. So the difference between visitor visa, ESTA, and status. This is a really great question, especially for Canadians, because generally you don't have to get a visa for many things, except for an E2, which is, certain types of things require visas. But so status, when you get to the border, or when you leave out of Pearson Airport or Vancouver, when you fly out and you go through U.S. Customs and they say, okay, you're admitted to the United States as a visitor, you're approved, keep going. You have just been given status, right? So that's status. You've been given B1, which is business visitor, or B2, that's visitor for pleasure. You've been given that status for a specific period of time. They used to give you that index card that you would staple into your passport, the I-94. They went paperless. If you and I drink about this, they went paperless a few years ago, which means they expect for you to go online and print it out and staple it into your passport. But that's the status and that control. So that's called the I-94 and that status. Visa, as opposed to that, a visa is a travel document that says you've been approved by the Department of State and you're eligible to travel to the port of entry, but it does not guarantee you admission to the United States. Does that make sense? So visa says you can get a visitor visa in your passport if you weren't Canadian, you needed it, and you could travel to the port of entry, and at the port of entry, they'll look at your visa and say, yes, we grant you status in the United States as long as you travel. And then the last part is ESTA. So if you're not Canadian There are certain countries that we call visa waiver countries. There's 32 countries. They also do not have to get, if they have not, as long as they qualify and they're eligible, the applicants, they don't have to go get a B1, B2 visa from the consulate to travel to the United States as a visitor. They can travel under this visa waiver program. The really big difference, and this kind of shows off why Canadians are lucky, they're limited to 90 days when they enter on an ESTA. It cannot be extended. They can't do anything about it. So different than a Canadian who's not limited to that period of time. There's a little bit more flexibility. But those are really the differences in those three.
Okay. Do we see anything changing coming up with any new rules and stuff? Is this gonna be relaxed? Is it gonna be tightened?
I mean, what I'm hoping for is some clarification. I think we'll get to this a little bit because there's a big difference. I mean, you and I talked about this a lot, and just our personal conversations. There's what the law actually is. There's what's on the internet, which is terrifying. And then there's what the officers do within their discretion at the border. But quite often, what the officers do with their discretion at the border, their interpretation of the law, what you see on the internet, and what the actual law is, are all three very different things. So I think what I would like to see is some greater policy guidance come from the Department of Homeland Security to Customs, to CBP to say this is the proper application of the law, and just slightly better policy guidance and training on it.
Now, is entering the United States by plane, going through Pearson or YVR, is it easier to go through on a flight than it is to stand in line and go across the border?
It depends on what you're doing. It depends on the port, right? So there's some ports of entry that I said that, and I won't say them live on a podcast. There's certain ports of entry that immigration lawyers, when you engage them, will tell you don't ever go to that port of entry. It's not the greatest port, not a great history. And it just depends on the type of entry too, right? Like if you're entering as a visitor, then most ports are really terrific. If you're trying to apply for a management consultant work permit under NAFTA or USMCA, there's certain ports of entry that have a history of better training, better understanding of that category, and we would advise. But generally, the land ports for visitors, the land ports and the airports are all about the same. But a secret tip I'll tell you is if you have a problem at one port, so say if you show up at Vancouver Airport to fly to the U.S. and they do not let you in as a visitor, or they have an issue with your documentation, do not go to the next port that same day and try to get in. They call that forum shopping, and it will get you banned from the United States. So if you have that happen to you, if you get to a port of entry and they don't let you in, it's not go to another port. It's call an immigration lawyer. That's what you need to do at that moment.
Okay, I'm going to write that down. That's a very good tip. Do not go to another port. Okay.
They get very upset when they think you're trying to go around them.
Call Oliver. Okay, I got that. That's now what we did last year. We had a webinar, and the picture we had was a car with a U-Haul attached to it,
Yeah.
and going across the border. What are you doing, sir? We're going down for our typical winter holiday. You're saying
all
that,
of our things, everything, right?
yeah, everything's in there. Computer screens and the cats and the dogs and the family and the kids, the whole work. So you're saying that is a no-no.
Well, it is, and like so when you, and again, it's not that. And there's what abouts, right? You can say that for sure. What if you are a snowbird that has a second home in the United States and you're taking down furnishings to furnish that second home? Sure, that's great, but you have to see the way that looks to the officer, right? So when you're entering the U.S. as a visitor, they're looking, no, but at any point, when you're in the U.S. as a visitor, they're looking at two primary issues, right? What are you doing when you're down there? Because only certain things are allowed, and I can elaborate on that a bit more. But the other big one is, how do we know you're coming back to Canada, right? Is your intent still temporary? If you're there with a U-Haul truck with the cats and the computer screens and all your belongings, there's a very reasonable assumption on behalf of the officer that you're not planning on coming back, that you're moving on down there to the U.S. Now, can that be overcome? Sure. Just got to have the right legal documentation to say, this is my primary home in Canada. This is my second home. We're furnishing it. We are not moving down, and the cats get very upset if we leave them, right? Like, you got to have a good story for what's going on.
Okay, so I'm going to cross off U-Haul as one of my major sponsors on this podcast.
Hey, U-Haul and immigration go really, really, really well together. You just got to have your documentation lined up. Sorry about the U-Haul. You're terrific.
Yeah, that's right. So here's another great question, and you kind of touched on it, is that what are you allowed to do when you are in the United States as a visitor?
Sure. So, I mean, remember, we have our two kind of subcategories here. We have visitor for pleasure, which is all the great stuff, right? It's going with the boys to Vegas. It's going with the kids to Disney World. It's hanging out at beautiful Maui Beach, right? All the things you think of tourist activities, that's all allowed as a visitor for pleasure. There's other things you can do, weddings, family events, meetings from businesses. You can attend meetings, you can attend conferences, you can attend trade shows, you can negotiate contracts. There's some additional kind of activities that you want to talk to a lawyer before you start using these because there's documentation you have to have. But investigating investment opportunities, after sales service, some training programs, and some professional athletes can be in the U.S. as a visitor. But in general, not working is the answer. Not working is the thing you want to avoid. You're not supposed to be working when you're down there.
Okay, so when Canadians go down to the States and they're attending a national business conference,
Sure.
and we're going to use Tampa Bay as an example.
Perfect example.
When
yeah.
a person crosses that border, should they let the immigration person or the border crossing agent know that should be like a B1 status? Is that correct?
Well, I just, you don't want to tell the officer what status, but you do want to be straightforward with them. And there's nothing wrong with attending a trade show or conference, specifically what's allowed. But you want to have documentation of that. So what I always say is you don't want to over disclose, right? We joke about that all the time. Like, answer the question the officer asked you at the port of entry concisely. But what are you going in for? I'm going in for a business conference. Here's my registration. Here's my round trip plane ticket. You've just sent both of their legal issues. You just told them you're coming back to Canada and that you're doing something you're allowed to do while you're there. You're golden.
Now, would that count as a day in the States from a I-94 point of view? Or
it certainly does. Any day in the
does.
States, any day you're physically in the States or traveling to or from the United States counts from an immigration law perspective for days in the United States.
Okay, that's good to know. I wish I had that information 2 weeks ago. I could have made myself look really intelligent, Oliver, when I was asked that question. Okay, so here's something that is so confusing. Okay, and I said these questions would get tougher and they're going to be longer.
Yeah.
Is there a 180 or a 183 day rule for Canadian visitors in the U.S.? And is there a rolling 12-month period or calendar year for Canadians?
So no. And I know I can hear people are just a shock at that moment because they've heard it. And what I will tell you is, again, I'm going to tell you right now what the law is, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that actually means in real life, because sometimes it doesn't mean a whole lot, right? If it depends on an officer's perspective, right? But here's what that misconception is. It's actually two different rules being read together and confused with each other. So, and it's immigration and tax. What keeps our firm afloat, right? With these two different legal concepts, right? So but here's the thing, but they're reading together to get that rolling calculation. I can only be in the U.S. 6 months a year. It's actually reading the rules together, getting them both wrong. So let's separate them a little bit. Now, I'm an immigration lawyer, just a caveat, not a tax lawyer. So I wrote down the tax answer here. So if I'm reading a little bit, that's what I'm doing. So, okay, let's talk about the tax rule first. So the tax is you spend too much time in the U.S., you're going to end up having to file a U.S. income tax return. What does the U.S. Internal Revenue Service use to figure that out? It's called the substantial presence test. That's the test. And how does that work? Okay. So, and again, when you do the substantial present test, you're determining your tax residency for that year, but it uses this rolling kind of calculation. So the way that it works is physically present in the U.S. on at least 31 days of the current year, and the sum of the following must equal 183 days or more. All the days in the current year plus 1/3 of the days in the immediate preceding year plus 1/6 of the days in the second preceding year, which is definitely designed by tax lawyers to keep tax lawyers employed, because that's a ridiculous way to calculate something, but that's the way that it works, right? So you have your tax rule there, which means to determine any given year, they're looking back at the prior. Now, what does that mean? What happens if you hit the standard? What happens if you were there? What that does not mean is that you have departed Canada as a tax resident and become a U.S. tax resident. What it might mean is you're going to have to file a U.S. tax return and make sure that you square that away with your Canadian tax return. And that's a good question for an accountant, not for me. But that's the tax answer. Make sense?
Now, yeah, well, like I say, I thought it was intelligent until about earlier today when I started reading the 12-month calendar. So once again, to really dummy this down.
Yeah. That's just the tax side, not the immigration side.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna tell you that what my schedule looks like over the next little while here. November 15th, I'm planning to go to Maui.
Yeah.
That's 15 days.
Yeah.
In December, that's going to be 31 days.
Yeah.
January's 31, February's 28, March is 31, and April is 30. Now I'm going to do the math for it. It's 166 days.
Yep.
What should I be concerned about the previous year and the year going forward? And I'm going to ask that from the calculator that we set up,
Yep.
1/6, 1/3,
Yep.
and a full day.
Yep.
Is there anything I should be concerned or anything I should be planning around that calendar?
Now, again, the tax side, you probably understand that better than I do on that rolling calculator. You're going to potentially run into an immigration issue, not the tax issue. I might step aside on that one and let someone else. But the immigration, you're going to run into an issue, not because you violated any of the rules, though.
Oh, okay.
Make it more confusing?
No. So when you say immigration, what should I be concerned?
Okay.
I'm not going to pick up my phone. Actually, you know what? I full disclosure. I might have to go off to. I'm going to be doing Zoom calls, and I might be doing some signing documents on Signex or with DocuSign. Is there anything I should be concerned about? I'm not soliciting. I'm not doing anything.
You're down there in the U.S. You mean?
I'm in the U.S. Yeah, I'm in the U.S.
You know what? You and I have been talking about those too. It's a wonderful gray area at the moment, right? Like it's a terrific gray area where you're, from an immigration law perspective, what you're not doing is taking the spot of a U.S. worker, right? You're not filling the spot of a U.S. worker. You're not on a U.S. payroll. You're not being paid by a U.S. company. So from an immigration law perspective, puts us in kind of a gray area. From a tax law perspective, kind of a gray area for the individual, maybe raises a tax issue for the company, the Canadian company that you work for, right? There's an argument there that we may have a PE. But what I will say is that the laws right now have not caught up with the actual way that we're all living. I mean, I'm a U.S. person, but if I was in the U.K. and a client called and I didn't pick up for a day and a half, they would fire me. So I'm going to have to pick up that phone call, right? So I'm working one of those different places too. So one is I wouldn't say that you're working when you're down there.
I never used the W word.
Correspond. You never use the W word ever.
Yeah.
You're corresponding. You're doing client communications. You're not soliciting sales. I'll be careful about the way that you disclose that. But the laws, I think that we will in the next 5 to 10 years see both immigration laws and tax laws kind of try to address this issue. But as of right now, there is no law kind of catching this. It's an interesting gray area. But do you mind if I step back a little bit to the immigration side of that rolling calendar? So again, Canadians will find this really surprising because they've heard it online, they've heard it from officers at the border sometimes. There is no 6-month limit from an immigration law perspective for a Canadian to be in the U.S. a year as a visitor. There just isn't. There is no maximum amount of days that a Canadian could be in the U.S. per year as a visitor from an immigration law perspective. What there is this. Anytime, generally, when a Canadian, this is unlike many people from other parts of the world, but generally when a Canadian enters the U.S. for the first time in a while, right? You're given 6 months of status. Remember that I-94 at the border? You're given 6 months of status. Now, if you leave during that 6-month period, you leave the U.S. for less than 30 days and come back in, they generally will give you the rest of that 6 months of status. Okay, but that doesn't mean that 6 months of status is all you're allowed to be in the United States from a legal perspective. And here's some great examples of that. We have clients that are in the U.S. They're investigating investment opportunities. They're setting up a company in the United States. They're not working, but they're setting up a U.S. company to get it ready to file for work in the United States. Sometimes they'll be in the U.S. for 5.5 months, but they're not quite finished. They need a couple more months to get it to the point to file it. We can extend that visitor status inside the United States, ask for another 6 months, and the status is protected the entire time they're pending in the U.S. So that could be up to a longer period of a year. I have some clients that entered the U.S. went to Maui, actually, before COVID hit. They're senior citizens. COVID hit. They could not travel. They stayed in Maui. We've been extending their visitor status we just finished doing it last year. They were there for 2 years and they went back. So there is no actual limit that you can be in the U.S. as a visitor, as a Canadian per year. Here's where the legal issue does come up, is the intent issue. if you've been in the U.S., for 8 months, if you were there for 6 months, you extended your status, you were there for 8 or 9 months, and then you leave for a month and you come back to the port, there's a decent chance that the officer is going to look at that travel history and say, I do not believe, one, that you're not working while you're down there because how you support yourself. So they're going to ask that question. And two, we don't believe your intent is temporary anymore. It doesn't look temporary. We don't see that your home is still in Canada, right? So you can certainly overcome that, but that's the legal issue. Now, that's the legal. So again, we have this tax rolling calculation. That's one part of the rule that got confused, right? And then we have the immigration rules, which are different. That Canadians are generally allowed 6 months when they enter. They have the temporary intent. Those two rules being read together is where we end up with people thinking that there's a rolling calculation on how many days they can be in the U.S. per year. That's the law, but here's where it gets super complicated. The officers at the border all have their own interpretation of the regulations. Some of them, their training is to kind of be more suspicious of people that have spent longer times. So they'll say to someone, oh, you've been in for 6 months. You better not come back here for 4 months. You better not come back here for 5 or 6 months. That's not them telling you the law is 6 months. That's just them saying, we don't believe your intent is temporary. But that's not really the law. So what I generally tell people is that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the actual law is, because it's hard to argue with an officer in their discretion. So in all practical aspects, you want to kind of keep, from a tax perspective and from an immigration perspective, you want to keep them below 183 days a year if possible. But that is not what you are restricted to. That's just practical advice to keep in line on both sides.
When you're traveling down to the States on conferences, and I know I've listed off before that you're the big kahuna of anything that's involved with immigration law and both Canadian and the U.S. side. How in depth do you guys go into this, and how often are the rules and the law that's changed? Is it always changing, or is it always been the same?
It's not really changing. I mean, it's stayed this way for quite a bit of time. If a lot of this law that you look at, it really comes. It's coming from a policy, right? It's coming from an administrative interpretation of law, and you see it in the two places you really see this kind of hashed out is CBP uses what's called the Adjudicators Field Manual. That's where their policies they get updated, kind of put in place, and then you have the Department of State, the Foreign Affairs Manual. These are where you see these two kind of concepts. Now, if you look at them, it specifically says the number of days spent in the U.S. is not indicative of temporary intent. There is no maximum day you can be in the U.S. It says that in their own manuals. But then what you have beyond that is you have these manuals that then interpreted into training. But then you also just have officers that they do it so often. They see enough people coming through. There's indicators in their mind when someone's intent is no longer temporary, and that's kind of what you're seeing. But the law doesn't change. Hasn't changed in many years on that. The policy guidance evolves over time. Through the American Immigration Lawyers Association, we have been lobbying some of our friends at the Department of State and Department of Homeland Security for years to provide some further clarity, both to the officers at the border, but also to travelers. Like, most travelers are not looking to break the rules. They're not looking to get in trouble. They just want to know what the rules are so they don't break them. And it's very, very difficult to understand those rules.
Now, we do call this the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. So we always address the Canadian side, but what about the expats, the Americans coming up to Canada? Do you find that is it more strict as a Canadian going down states, or is it more strict for an American coming up to Canada?
It's a lot more. Well, it depends on what. Generally, the U.S. is a lot more strict all around. And I don't know whether that's just the sunny weather just becking so many people down from a volume perspective. I'm an American living in Canada, so clearly there's some pull both directions. But I think that there really is far more strict in the way you're going. And when you come to Canada, they're still looking at the same things. You can't be working as a visitor. They're still looking at the status. But even, for example, the idea of intent is different, right? So in Canada, for example, you could be an American that's married to a Canadian citizen that's going to be filing for a green card in Canada based off that marriage. You can still get it as a visitor into Canada while that's pending and extend the visitor, and they know that your intent is permanent. So it's a little bit different standard there. Canadians at the border seem to be a little bit more trustworthy than the American officers. They kind of are believing you with less evidence. Here's the only thing where Canada is way more strict: DUIs. If you are a Canadian that has one DUI, you can get into the U.S. You don't have an inadmissibility problem. If you have more than one, you're going to have to get a waiver. Canada, if you're an American with one DUI, you can get into Canada without it being like years since that happened. So there are some areas where Canada is a little bit more strict. That's one of them, but generally it's the U.S. that's far more strict.
Okay, before we move beyond this 12-month rolling calendar, so you're saying that's more of a tax. I mean, this came up with one of the users of the app was in Arizona, and he mentioned that this national firm came back and said, well, you spent way too much time on a rolling 12-month calendar, and you're going to have to file a U.S. tax return. And I guess that's a great question for our U.S. accountants out there. But that's really
right. That's where it comes up, right? It is that's where you're in from that actual day count thing. That's where that's coming up. And again, they're not saying that he's ceased becoming a Canadian tax resident, right? They're not saying that he's into a massive problem. It's just that substantial present just means you're going to end up with more compliance, but not a bigger tax burden, right? As long as you get the paperwork and you talk to your accountant, you get things done the right way. But again, if there's a tax side of it, there's an immigration side of it, there's what the actual rules are, and then there's just the practical, like the easy rule to tell yourself is spend less than 180 days per year, and you're not going to end up with this problem, right? With it, but it's not the exact rule. You're right. There's an immigration and a tax rule there.
Okay. So here's a question. So you did mention E2 visas, and I know that's a big part of what you do and we've referred some friends from Maui and that are going through the E2 visa process as we speak. Can a Canadian, the whole intentions of you never want to exit Canada. Yeah. Especially with Hawaii, the things we're finding out is that if a person was to
Ontario,
it's a state tax. So if you were a Canadian, you were going to Maui and you were exiting Canada, if you had a large RSP, even if you did not take those funds out of your RSP, you're still going to have to pay tax on them. You're going to have to declare dividends, interest, capital gains on a state return. Now, is it possible for a person to have an E2 visa, not exit Canada, and just pay corporate tax and not personal tax?
Sure.
So I wouldn't have to file as an American. So, okay, we'll use me as an example. I get my E2 visa. I'm doing all the Snowbird app work in the United States, living in Maui. I got to pinch myself. It sounds like a dream, Oliver.
It does sound good. I'm coming too. Yeah.
I know, exactly. We're going to have 150 people under that E2 visa. So I'm not sure what we're going to be doing, but so we have this E2 visa. I'm there and I'm concerned because I have this large RRSP, but in theory, I don't really technically have to file a personal tax return. I can just work around the E2 visa as a corporation.
Again, I don't want to speak too much to the taxes because that isn't where my intelligence is in the immigration side of things. But you are right. It's a different amount of, like, if you get a green card, for example, in the United States. So people call us all the time and they say, hey, I'm married to a dual citizen. Why don't we just skip the E2? I'll just go get the green card. And I hear every tax lawyer to come and go, no, stop. Because when you get a U.S. green card, you are required to file your U.S. taxes as a resident, a U.S. tax resident, and you depart Canada taxes. You're forcing the scenario. You have to do it. The great thing about an E2 is it's not a green card. It's a non-immigrant temporary intent visa, even though it can be renewed in 5-year increments forever. So we have lots of clients that maintain their Canadian tax residency. They have the U.S. business. They have the E2. If there's any personal income earned in the United States, then they would have to file a U.S. tax return to deduct that from foreign tax credit for the Canadian tax return. If they do not earn personal income in the United States, whether it's corporate tax, there's much smarter ways to do that where you end up with a 21% corporate tax in the United States. And that's where the brilliant tax accountants and tax planners come in to tell you how to handle that all the right way. But you're right. The E2 does not put you in the same situation. It gives you flexibility. It allows you to kind of plan and work with your tax preparer and get the right tax strategy in place so that you certainly don't end up double taxed, but you also, end up doing things in just the right way. And it can be quite advantageous from a tax planning perspective if you do that right.
Now, you brought up a great question. You said it's an intent visa, meaning that it's I'm not sure temporary intent. So you must have this question all the time. People want to fulfill their fantasy. They want to go buy the $20 million house and go to City National and say, I want to borrow $20 million.
Yeah.
In theory, that visa would restrict how you really set up a personal life over there.
Well, they could. I mean, it kind of. I mean, so here's the thing. From the temporary intent standpoint, it's not like a visitor temporary intent where you have to prove you're coming back, right, to Canada. That you don't have to do that with this. With the E2, you just have to say, I realize that if my E2 expires or this business is closed or I no longer have E2 status, I have to go back to Canada, right? Where I think you might see some restrictions are that and I'll just do it the other way around. Before I was a permanent resident of Canada, when I had a work permit in Canada and I would go lease a car, they would limit the term of my lease to the term that I was allowed to work permit because that's how they know to get the money from me. So sometimes you will end up with that same issue with an E2. It's issued in 5-year increments. I always find kind of the way to work around that is making sure that you're working with a great cross-border bank, right? And you mentioned one, a great cross-border bank that has operations on both sides because they are often allowed to kind of utilize Canadian credit. They're kind of doing to work between the two and get you the best of both worlds. It certainly doesn't stop many of our clients from buying their dream homes. In Maui, quite a few. We have some mutual clients that are doing that. It's certainly all possible. You want to have the right Gerry Scott from a financial planning perspective, the right tax folks, the right tax accountants, the right immigration lawyer, and the right cross-border bank. If you have those things lined up well, you and I both know there's a whole other list. You want to make sure your wills and estates are in line and all those sort of things. But those are the kind of the key elements. If you're doing all those things are possible. That kind of dream life is there. You just got to plan it the right way before you dive into it.
Well, that brings up a very good point because I find that at all times you have to establish these teams. And because most cases, if you've got these 3 independent people and they're all heading in their own direction, and communication is fragile at the best of times.
Yes.
Never mind if you're communicating. So I do find that if I'm talking to yourself or if I'm talking to the big kahuna,
Yeah.
Kim Moody.
The little big kahuna,
yeah, the little big kahuna. Okay, you said it first. Okay,
I did. I'm his friend.
I hope Mike can edit that part of the this
Don't
podcast.
edit that, Mike. Leave it in.
Okay, leave it in. We want people got to start realizing who really is the big kahuna of this firm. Hey, Oliver. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's so true that it's so complicated, and this is what I enjoy about this space that you and I work in, is that if someone comes to us with a crazy idea, it might not be a crazy idea.
Yeah, no, that'd be a great fun idea.
Yeah, we really can help them along the way to make sure they got the right people and they're fully compliant and they really understand and
right.
There's pre-planning involved and
having all the right minds together that think about it that way, right? Like I can't tell you how many times, like if they just do my part, but they don't talk to Gerry Scott about where their assets are, what they're doing, and how they're going to plan that, like you just end up with half the picture. And usually you end up paying a lot more to the CRA and the IRS and screwing it all because you just didn't bring the right bench together at the beginning to make sure you're looking at all those issues. It usually saves you money in the long run.
Well, what I've told a lot of folks that we do talk to is that you want to make sure you have a good immigration lawyer on speed dial. You want to have a good U.S. tax person on speed dial, and really be careful that this is what we've also been learning is that when you have an American living in Canada and they're filing tax returns, they are filing federal returns. That's all they're required to file because they live in Canada. They're not tied to a state. But when you do the planning to say, I want to move to Maui or I want to move to Montana as another one or California, be careful because if you're a Canadian, if you're American and lived up in Canada, you've acquired a lot of wealth in your RSP. Be careful because those states will tax it. And what I'm understanding is that the reason why they tax it is because they either don't they ignore the treaty between Canada and the United States.
Hawaii ignores that treaty a lot of times, right?
Yeah, sadly, you can pick down your favorite states as a Canadian,
really
and
is.
I can guarantee you that there's state tax.
It is. Well, and does that mean that you don't want to move your dream and move there? No, it just means you need to know what that is, right? Like I always laugh at tax lawyers. Tax lawyers only see tax. That's all they see. So when I moved from North Carolina, a relatively low tax jurisdiction, to Ontario, and they all think I'm nuts, like absolutely nuts. Why would you ever do that? Why would you ever move to Hawaii, California, or New York, right? Why would you ever do that? It's because tax isn't always it isn't the thing that motivates or drives all of us, but it is something to think about and plan for, right? It is different. You do need to kind of know what you're stepping into.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it really is. I mean, everything. We used to do those little avatar videos, and Oliver was involved with one of them. We used to always say, have a plan before you land.
Yeah. Yeah.
because it
Those were
can.
cute videos. I like those videos. They were pretty well done.
Well, none of us had to wear makeup. All we had to do was wear crayons. That's what it
Yeah,
was.
it worked really well, right? We looked
Exactly.
great. We looked very young. It was terrific.
Well, I'll tell you what, before we let you go, because I know you have a very busy schedule. So once again, the 12-month rolling calendar is, we probably confuse people even more. Probably, but we were going to be having a webinar, and I think the biggest thing, a webinar, which we'll do with Oliver and myself, and we will bring in a U.S. tax person because I'm not an accountant, a U.S. accountant. Oliver is not a U.S. accountant, and knowing a little bit is dangerous in this world, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So when we do put together this podcast, this webinar, we'll make sure that we have a very good. And Oliver, we know that you and I will have very little to say because the accountant will go on forever and ever and ever with an answer. So we're just going to be sit there and. But we will put this together. I know how important it is for people, and we'll make it a live webinar. That's what webinars are, and we'll do that over probably do it over the next couple of months, I would think, depending on people's schedules. And but thank you once again. It's very interesting, and this is the number one thing I tell people: make sure you have a good immigration lawyer. I'm probably repeating myself, on speed dial. And you can always reach out to myself and Oliver's information. He's very easy to be found. So Oliver, thanks again. And I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
Oh, you as well.
Thank you for listening to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. Our app is available for your iPhone and your Android. If you have any questions, call me 604-612-7526. Until our next podcast, I'm Gerry Scott.